Think any terrorist in the world doesn't realize that all the information is being scarped up? It is not a secret that they're doing this. So we should have an open debate in a free society about how it should be done and whether you can gather information in a way that's consistent with the Constitution. When we get to the Privacy and Civil Liberty Board's recommendations, they have several good recommendations. Number one, the government should end its Section 215 bulk telephone records program, period. They say that the program, as it is constituted, implicates constitutional concerns under the First and Fourth Amendments. This is the President's Privacy and Civil Liberties Board. Without the current Section 215 program, the government would still be able to seek telephone calling records directly from the communications providers through other existing legal authorities. I think the other existing legal authorities could be the Constitution. Could we not just call a judge and get a warrant and go down to the phone company and get what we want? I think there's a way that we can do this that is still consistent with the Constitution. The other recommendation they have, other than ending the program, is that when the bulk collection program is ended, that the records should be purged, so there's no chance that this can be abused again in the future. One of the arguments for the NSA has been that they collect the data, it's in a database, but that it's only accessed then when they have what they call reasonable articulable suspicion. One of the recommendations of the Privacy Board, though, was that they not be given the ability to judge whether there is reasonable articulable suspicion, that it would actually go to an independent judge to determine this. So the recommendation of the Policy Board was that these should go to the review of the FISA court before they are able to query the database. There are many different groups that have been fighting for privacy in our country, and it's a coalition of people both from the right and from the left. You've seen it today as different senators have come out here. We've had senators from the Republican Party as well as the Democrat Party. We've had those from the right, from the left. We've had conservatives, libertarians. We've had progressives. There's been a combination of folks who all sort of have one thing in common, and that's the belief that the Bill of Rights should be protected. Among the private groups that have done a good job with this, Electronic Frontier Foundation has been one of the groups that's done a great job here. In one of their newsletters, they quote Ron Wyden, and he says, "We have not yet seen any evidence showing that the NSA's dragnet collection of Americans' phone records has produced any uniquely valuable intelligence." Patrick Eddington writes for Cato. Cato's been another group that's been a good supporter of privacy. In an article that talks about the upcoming battle from a couple of weeks ago, he writes, this is of the USA Freedom Act. And this is sort of the big debate, because many people on both sides of the aisle think that the bulk collection of records is not constitutional. We think it exceeds the government's power, exceeds the Constitution. But what many are proposing to replace it is the USA Freedom Act. This is what Patrick Eddington writes. The USA Freedom Act claims to end the controversial telephone metadata program, but a close reading of the bill reveals that it actually leaves key part of Patriot Act definitions of person or U.S. person intact. So a person is defined as any individual, including officer or employee of the federal government, or any group, entity, association, corporation, or foreign power. So the question I have is, it sounds good that we're going to make the definition of whose records we go out, we're going to say it's going to be a specific U.S. person. The problem is that we then define person as corporation. And so we get back to the same argument. If we're going to search the database of all of your phone calls and we say that a person is Verizon, we're stuck again back collecting everybody's records. And what I don't want to have happen, and I won't be able to support, is a bill that becomes bulk collection of your records just under a different venue. You know, to me, I'm not sure that your privacy has been protected more if that we're now just asking the phone companies for bulk collection, where we were taking their data, sourcing it, and getting it from the companies after they gave it to the government. I'm just not sure if it's that much distinctly difference. In the USA Freedom Act, they talk about the idea that we would get special advocates, and I'm for that. I think that's a good idea. But Patrick Eddington points out a flaw in this. He says that the FISA court has sole discretion to appoint or not appoint these amicus curiae, or these special advocates. So it could be that a FISA court that really has not been too inquisitive, a FISA court that has determined that all of your records are somehow relevant, may not be the most inquisitive to appoint an advocate for you if they've been able to define relevance as meaning all of your records. Another deficiency of the USA Freedom Act is that it does not address bulk collection under Executive Order 12333. The bill also fails to address bulk collection under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. Now, you could just say, what are you complaining about? You're getting some improvement. You still got problems, but we're getting some improvement. I guess my point is that we're having this debate, and we don't have it very often. We're having the debate every 3 years, and some people have tried to make this permanent where we'd never have any debate. And even though we're only having it every 3 years, it's still uncertain whether I'll be granted any amendments to this bill. So, yeah, I'd like to address everything while we can. I think we ought to address Section 702. I think we ought to, for goodness sakes, why wouldn't we have some hearings on the Executive Order 12333? Now, I think they may be having them in secret, but I go back to what Senator Wyden said earlier. I think the principles of the law could be discussed in public. We don't have to reveal how we do stuff. Do you think anybody in the world thinks we're not looking at their stuff? Why don't we explore the legality and the law of how we're doing it, as opposed to leaving it unsaid and unknown and secret? Part of our secrecy is sort of backfiring on us also, because what's happening is, in keeping this secret, people believe the worst. Everybody around the world believes the worst about us. Everybody around the world believes that they're having all their stuff looked at, that their emails will be looked at. So if you're a business person in Europe and you're trying to negotiate a secure deal, a deal that you don't want your competitors to know what you're offering to buy a certain company, I would think you probably wouldn't use American email. And I would guess that's what's happening. American companies are starting to try to figure out a way around this to try to offer encryption. And what's the government do? The president's administration's all over the airwaves, all over Washington, all over the place, talking about how that the companies are somehow evil for wanting to encrypt their data. And I saw the Secretary of Homeland Security in my committee the other day, and I said, you realize it's your fault It's not the company's fault that they're trying to protect their information for their customers. They're trying to make a living. It's your fault for bullying them and stealing their information and stealing all of Americans' information. We're simply reacting to the bully that you are. Most of the things that Patrick Eddington points out in this piece are things that we actually have amendments that would make stronger. So if there are arguments that maybe the USA Freedom Act could be made better, definitely reauthorizing it by itself is a big mistake, but that if there's going to be offered alternatives, then maybe we could try to offer alternatives that makes the USA Freedom Act better. The other one that they offer here, or that Patrick Eddington puts forward, is that there's no bar on the government imposing backdoors being built into electronic devices. So that's what we've talked about before, that the government is mandating to different companies that they have to have access to their product. And I think it's been an under-discussed development that the companies are going to be more at risk for sabotage by foreign countries, foreign governments, and sabotage from hackers if they build a portal. So if the government says, we need a portal to stick our big nose in your business and suck up all your information, my guess is that sophisticated hackers and sophisticated foreign governments will say, you know what? Most of American software now has a flaw, and the American government's getting into it. What do you think that these people will do? Develop programs to look for the flaws and churn through until they find our flaws. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be trying to keep foreign governments, foreign snoopers, foreign competitors out of our stuff, including the U.S. government. But we're doing the opposite. There's a lot to be desired with the U.S. Freedom Act. I try to be supportive of moving forward, but I can't support it unless we're able to incorporate some of the other ideas that I think are necessary. The people who say we're just not doing enough. This week, many have come out and said, we've got to collect more data. We've got to, we're only collecting a third of the data. We've got to get more data. The interesting thing is that we're spending $52 billion a year on intelligence in our country. $52 billion. $10 billion in the NSA alone. It's $167 per person in the U.S. I think it's hard to argue we're not doing enough already. I think the argument can be made, though, that we're doing it in such a haphazard, all-collecting, all-consuming, indiscriminate way that maybe we're not getting the best bang for our buck. There have been many groups out there. We mentioned Electronic Frontier Foundation, Tech Freedom, Liberty Coalition, Gen Opportunity, Competitive Enterprise Institute, FreedomWorks. A lot of different groups from right and left that are opposed to this bulk collection of data. There was an interesting article recently written by Anthony Romero with the ACLU, and the title of it was "The Sun Must Go Down on the Patriot Act." In it, he refers back to both, the review group that we talked about and the Civil Liberties Oversight Board. And he says and reiterates a point that's incredibly important, that there's no evidence at all that the NSA's massive surveillance program has ever played a pivotal role in any investigation. See, I think we ought to be able to figure out something from this, and we ought to be able to learn that not only is there the constitutional question of this, there's also the question of whether practically it's doing anything to make us safer. If it's not making us safer, It's extraordinarily expensive, and we're losing our freedom in the process. Why don't we shut it down? Different advocacy groups for a variety of opinions have put forward the idea that I think was represented in the NAACP versus Alabama. I believe this was back in the 70s, which set forth a First Amendment claim. And this claim is that there's a vital relationship between freedom of association and privacy in one's associations. The point is that sometimes when you're protesting either for or against something, it's very unpopular. Sometimes you even worry about your safety. There were people who lost their lives in the freedom movement and the civil rights movement. There were people who lost their lives, and you can understand how in those days people might have been worried for anybody to know that they belonged to the NAACP or that they opposed the Jim Crow of the South. But it was an important case because it talked about how the fact is that information can be kept private and should be kept private for fear that it will chill speech, for fear that it will put a damper on who people would associate, for fear that it would put a damper on dissent, which is a fundamental aspect of a republic. In a letter from a couple of weeks ago from some congressional leaders, they point out something that I think bears repeating. Mass surveillance, the bulk collection, harms our economy. Mass surveillance will cost the digital economy up to $180 billion in lost revenue by 2016. We're not getting any new bad guys with this. We're abrogating privacy, and then we're losing money. The internet companies in our country, the whole software world, the whole hardware, all of this have been some of America's greatest triumphs, some of America's greatest ingenuity. And yet, we're willing to squash all that in a battle that really is going to damage our privacy, isn't helping us in the war against terrorism, and is going to make it such that nobody in the world is going to want to buy American products. I think it's a disgrace. And I think it's once again, it's not, I don't think it's purposeful. Nobody wants to harm our companies, but I think it is just another unintended consequence of a bad policy not thought through. The ACLU commentary on the USA Freedom Act has come up with some ideas of things they could think would make the bill stronger. One, they say that the bill could be amended to prevent surveillance of individuals with no nexus to terrorism. The USA Freedom Act would authorize the collection of records and communications identified by a specific term. This would stop the government from conducting indiscriminate surveillance of virtually all citizens from engaging in narrower but still egregious forms of abuse, like the surveillance of everyone in a zip code or all those who use a given communications provider like Gmail. However, the current SST definition is not strong enough to protect bulky collection. This is the point I've been making. And this is something you have to be really careful in Washington, because the minute you think you've won a battle, secretly you've been beaten, you just don't know it yet. And so we might get a reform like this and then find out that we're still going to get bulky collection, that a corporation's name could be put in the specific selector term. And so we were worried about the government giving us all of Verizon's records. Now we're just sending a warrant to Verizon that has their name in it, and we're getting all of their records. The example they put here is that you could still end up having the surveillance of everyone in an entire zip code or all of those who use a given communications provider like Gmail. So if Gmail is a specific term, are we not still back where we were, and have we really fixed the problem? The ACLU goes on to say that the bill should be amended to narrow the SST definition, the selector term, to prevent this kind of bulky surveillance. The bill should also make crystal clear, consistent with the Second Circuit, which has come out since this bill was written, that Section 215 cannot be used to amass Americans' records for open-ended data mining purposes, unmoored from any specific investigation. I think this is incredibly important. The USA Freedom Act wants to take a step forward, but we need to make sure that the ruling from the Second Court that has already passed, that we don't do something that either moots the case or we don't do something that actually expands the power of 215 when the court has already restricted the power of 215. The ACLU's second recommendation is that we should include procedures to ensure that the government purges irrelevant information. Right now, the bill would allow the collection of irrelevant information under 215 and other authorities without minimization procedures. This kind of reminds me, if you want to know how much information we're grabbing up and to be how worried about it, there was an article in the Washington Post a couple of months ago, and it said that the president had been minimized 1,227 times. We're collecting the president's data, all right? Now, you could say, well, we're being fair, we're getting everybody's. For goodness sakes, we should not be collecting the president's information. In fact, you might inadvertently have somebody reading that who really shouldn't be reading the president's information. We should not be collecting the president's information. That's ridiculous. But we're minimizing the president, which means we're finding it, and then we're sort of whiting it out and hoping nobody read it in the process. There were earlier versions of the USA Freedom Act that included some of these basic protections on getting rid of or minimizing irrelevant information that's got up, the bulky surveillance. This is sort of the problem. This bill started out pretty good in the House, got out of committee, got sort of eaten up on the floor, and wound up losing a lot of the better stuff that was in it. The third recommendation is what we mentioned a few minutes ago, is to make sure that there's a strong advocate, these special advocates, that it's a strong advocate that goes before the FISA court. As the Second Court decision observes, adversarial judicial process is vital, especially on matters as critically important as the government's authority to spy on its citizens. This is a really important point. The adversarial judicial process. There's Judge Napolitano has written on this, and I think he's made the point that without an adversarial process, you really can't even have a judicial process. If you don't have people on both sides arguing or advocating for a position, then it really isn't a court. I mean, it really is not a judicial proceeding that we can recognize as finding justice. But the FISA court only hears from one side, the government. But the ACLU points out that these advocates participate solely at the discretion of the court and can make arguments that do not advance privacy and civil liberties. Yeah, I mean, if you're hired by the government, are you really going to be the best advocate for privacy? The fourth suggestion that the ACLU has to make the USA Freedom Act better is that we should limit additional authorities that have been used to collect America's records in bulk. We now know that the government has conducted bulk surveillance not only under 215, but also under a host of other statutes, including existing administrative subpoena authorities. For example, for 2 decades, up until 2013, the Drug Enforcement Agency operated a program that collected the international call records of Americans in bulk, reporting under existing administrative subpoena laws. So here's a real question. What other authorities are we operating under that are collecting bulk records? They're doing it under administrative subpoena laws. They're doing it for the DEA. So I still think the more I've learned about this, the more questions I have. as to how many other authorities are still collecting things. I'd still like to know, are they collecting all the credit card information in the country? Are they doing that under executive authority? Are we really living in a country now where nobody in the government questions somebody when they say that under Article 2 authority, the president can do whatever he wants, and that this can't even be corrected or challenged at all by Congress? The fifth recommendation from the ACLU was to stop the government from using Section 702 of FISA as a backdoor to conduct surveillance on Americans. This was one of our amendments that we also have. In fact, most of these are amendments that I will present if we're allowed to present them, and which is sort of the purpose for being here and for wearing my feet out and my voice today, is that we'd like to find out, will the leadership allow us to have amendments? We would like to know and have an agreement that we will specifically be allowed to offer these amendments that we've worked on for 6 months to a year now. We've waited for 3 years for the opportunity. We'd like to know, will leadership let us have these amendments? Will leadership allow a free and open debate over how to fix this bulk collection program? The backdoor thing with 702 is a pretty important thing, and it's collecting enormous amounts of data. Earlier in the day, we talked about how this data, that 9 out of 10 pieces of data are not about the target. They're just incidental. So I think there was one estimate that we've had 90,000 targets, but it really means we've had 900,000 bits of information on other individuals collected, but it all just gets stuck in a database. So the database keeps growing and growing, and sometimes it's intentionally so that we want to investigate a guy here, but we don't want to ask for a warrant, so we investigate a guy overseas that we know already talks to a guy over here. Now we're really investigating Americans without a warrant. So they recommend that we stop this backdoor access. This is something Senator Wyden and I have also been in favor of as well. Another recommendation that the ACLU has here is that, our current laws punish individuals for providing material support to terrorists. I have no problem with that. But they have been used, apparently, to prosecute people that have been seeking to provide humanitarian assistance. The USA Freedom Act should add an explicit intent requirement to the material support laws. There's another comment from the Sunlight Foundation by Sean Vidka, and the title is, "The USA Freedom Act is about to pass the House. Is it a step backwards?" Sunlight and others have had major concerns about the USA Freedom Act for some time. Broadly speaking, it isn't a satisfactory level of reform, given what we've learned in the past 2 years about government surveillance and the immense secrecy that surrounds it. Until last week, it's fair to say some considered the bill a net positive, some a net negative, and that no one thought it was enough for reform. As time has progressed, we've seen what began in 2013 as a decent, if tunnel-visioned, compromise chipped away at, including the transparency and accountability provisions. Now, I think this is an important point because USA Freedom started out pretty good and it got a little bit less good over time. But think about where we are right now. Passed overwhelmingly in the House. The majority in the Senate doesn't want it because they think it lessens the bulk collection too much. So they're going to chip away at it again. So imagine where we're going to be in the end if that's what we're going to pass. I think it'd be better just to be done with bulk collection. Let's be done with bulk collection. Let's start over. But let's don't replace it with something that may end up being just as bad. The sacrifices made in the bill in order to secure these modest reforms grew more dramatic. For instance, while USA Freedom was always a threat to court challenges, and may have mooted the ACLU's tremendous court win last week if it had passed last year. This is the point I've been making. The luckiest thing we ever got is we didn't pass USA Freedom last year, because the courts are probably going to do right now, I think, a better job than legislation. In fact, we might be better off not passing the USA Freedom Act and seeing what the courts will do for us on this, because there is a danger it moots the case, but there's a danger also that it's seen as actually given justification for the program, which kind of, I guess, is a way of mooting the case as well. The ruling in the appellate court could also, they're agreeing with what I just said, could also do more than USA Freedom aspired to do, because it interprets the word relevance, saying it doesn't authorize bulk collection, and that the word is not only used, and that word is not used in Section 215. So I think that's a good point, that, the court is saying that the word relevance doesn't authorize bulk collection. And so you've got bulk collection going on, but no authorization from 215 on it. Here's the question: is USA Freedom going to allow bulky, perhaps bulk collection, and do we wind up actually giving back more power to the intelligence community when we're trying to limit their power? I think we need to be very careful with what we do here. Sunlight goes on to say, Sean Vidka, it's unclear whether the primary goal of USA Freedom, the rewriting of Section 215 to stop bulk collection, is already accomplished, and whether USA Freedom could open us all up to more secret interpretations and new venues of surveillance. I think that's an incredibly important question. Several groups that initially supported USA Freedom have backed away from it. ACLU and EFF agreeing that the U.S. freedom as it stands now is not worthy of support. And I think some of these may be neutral on it, but they've backed away from some of their support. Some of the concerns that Sean Vidka talks about here about shortcomings in USA Freedom Act is that he says that it accepts the premise that mass surveillance under these programs is necessary, despite the findings of the Congressional Joint Inquiry and the 9/11 Commission to the contrary. Also, despite the Privacy and Civil Liberties Commission that said it wasn't necessary. Sean Vidka goes on to say that one of his other concerns is that the U.S. Freedoms Act effectively continues mass surveillance under Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act through the use of multiple NSA-supplied selector terms. So you could say we're only going to do individual terms, but then you do a bunch of them. By the time we do a bunch, are we really individualizing it and not growing it into bulk collection? They include among these selection terms ones they're worried about, including the Internet Protocol address or cloud storage accounts of entire organizations, in contravention of the Fourth Amendment's particularized probable cause-based warrant. Additionally, Sunlight goes on to point out what I've pointed out as well, that the term person is not defined as an individual natural person, and the bill does not alter the Patriot Act's original definition of person, which includes any individual, officer or employee of the federal government, or any group, entity, association, corporation. I really fear what we could be back here doing is we think we won, we get the USA Freedom Act, and then 2 years from now we find out they're plugging the name Verizon into their selection term, and they're still collecting all the records from Verizon. So I think unless you can limit this to an individual, a natural person, I think really that's one of the biggest problems that we've got with the U.S. Freedom Act at this point. Sean Ditka goes on to say that there's a concern that it expands the corporate immunity, and we've discussed that as well today, that by removing the requirement that companies act in good faith, we also are going to pay the companies now to do this as well. Judge Napolitano wrote about this just the other day, May 14th. He writes, a decision last week about NSA spying by a panel of judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals in New York City sent shockwaves through the government. The court ruled that a section of the PATRIOT Act that is due to expire at the end of this month, on which the government has relied as a basis for its bulk collection and acquisition of telephone data in the past 14 years, does not authorize that acquisition. This may sound like legal mumbo-jumbo, but it goes to the heart of the relationship between the people and their government in a free society. The PATRIOT Act is the centerpiece of the federal government's false claim that by surrendering our personal liberties to it, it can somehow keep us safe. The liberty for safety offer has been around for millennia and was poignant at the time of the founding of the American Republic. The framers addressed it in the Constitution itself, where they recognized the primacy of the right to privacy and assured against its violation by government by intentionally forcing it to jump through some difficult hoops before it can capture our thoughts, words, or private behavior. These hoops are the requirement of a search warrant issued by a judge based on evidence called probable cause, demonstrating that it is more likely than not that the government will find what it is looking for from the person or place it is targeting. Only then may a judge issue a warrant which must specifically describe the place to be searched or specifically identify the person or thing to be seized. Napolitano goes on, none of this is new. It has been at the core of our system of government since the 1790s. It is embodied in the Fourth Amendment, which is the heart of the Bill of Rights. It is quintessentially American. The PATRIOT Act has purported to do away with the search warrant requirements by employing language so intentionally vague that the government can interpret it as it wishes. Add to this the secret venue for this interpretation, the FISA court, to which the PATRIOT Act directs that NSA applications for authority to spy on Americans are to be made. And you have the totalitarian stew that we have been force-fed since 2001. Because the FISA court meets in secret, Americans did not know that the feds were spying on us all of the time and relying on their own unnatural reading of the words in the PATRIOT Act to justify it until Edward Snowden spilled the beans on his former employer nearly 2 years ago. Another reason, I think, to question whether or not the USA Freedom may be the best bill for us, there was an article in the Daily Beast by Shane Harris the other day, and the title of it is Big Win for Big Brother. NSA celebrates the bill that's designed to cuff them. It was supposed to be the declawing of America's biggest spy agency. But what no one wants to say out loud is that this is a big win for the NSA, one former top spook says. Civil libertarians and privacy advocates were applauding yesterday after the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed legislation to stop the NSA from collecting America's phone records in bulk. But they'd best not break out the bubbly. The real big winner here is the NSA. Over at its headquarters in Fort Meade, intelligence officials are high-fiving because they know things could have turned out much worse. What no one wants to say out loud is that this is a big win for the NSA and a huge nothing burger for the privacy community, said a former senior intelligence official, one of a half a dozen who spoke to the Daily Beast about the phone records program and efforts to change it. Here's the dirty little secret that spooks are loath to utter publicly, but have been admitting in private for the past 2 years. The program, the bulk collection program, which was exposed in documents leaked by Snowden, is more trouble than it's worth. It's very expensive and very cumbersome, the former official said. It requires the agency to maintain huge databases of all America's landline phone calls, but it doesn't contribute many leads on terrorists. It has helped prevent few, if any, attacks, and it's nowhere near the biggest contributor of information about terrorism that ends up on the president's desks or other senior decision makers. If after the most significant public debate about balancing surveillance and government in a generation, this is the program the NSA has to give up, they're getting off easy. The bill that passed the House yesterday, called the USA Freedom Act, doesn't actually suspend the phone record program. Rather, it requires that phone companies, not the NSA, hold on to the records. That bears repeating, at least from the author's perspective of this article, that the USA Freedom Act doesn't actually suspend the phone records program. Rather, it requires that the phone companies, not the NSA, hold on to the records. Good, let them take them. I'm tired of holding on to this, a current senior U.S. official told Daily Beast. It requires teams of lawyers and auditors to ensure the NSA is complying with Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act, which authorized the program, as well as the internal regulations on how records can and can't be used. The phone records programs has become a political lightning rod, the most controversial of all the classified programs that Snowden exposed. If the NSA can still get access to the records but not have to hold on to themselves, all the better, the senior official said. It's a big win for common sense and for the country, Joel Brenner, the NSA's former inspector general, told Daily Beast. NSA can get to do what it needs to do with a higher level of scrutiny and a little more trouble, but it can still do what it needs to do. At the same time, the government's not going to hold the bulk metadata of the American people. The NSA is coming out of this unscathed, says the former official. If the USA Freedom Act passes the Senate, which is not a foregone conclusion, it'll be signed by the president and create a more efficient and comprehensive tool for the NSA. That's because under the current regime, only the logs of landline calls are kept. In the future, the NSA will be able to get the cell phone records from the companies too. That bears repeating. This week, everybody was talking about and saying, we're not getting enough. The people who want more surveillance are like, we're not getting enough. We're only getting the landlines. We're only getting a third of all the records. Here's the allegation. You do the USA Freedom Act, they're going to get many more records. They're going to have access to all the cell phone records. So the question is, are we going to really have less bulk collection or maybe the same? And there's another irony. This is still according to Shane Harris at the Daily Beast. Before the Snowden leaks, the NSA was already looking for alternatives to storing huge amounts of phone records. One of the ideas officials considered was asking Congress to require phone companies to hang on to that information for several years. The idea died, though, because NSA leaders thought that Congress would never agree. Kind of ironic that the NSA already thought of this idea, didn't think we would be silly enough to do it, and now it's being promoted as the reform, that the reform is going to be what the NSA actually wanted in the first place. Suddenly, the NSA found itself under orders from the White House, this is after the revelations from Snowden, to come up with some alternative to the phone records program that preserved it, but also put more checks on how the records are used. That's when General Keith Alexander, then the agency's director, dusted the old idea off the shelf and promoted it on Capitol Hill. That's right. The USA Freedom Act, the supposed reining in of the NSA, was literally born from Alexander, the former official said. So maybe the NSA is effectively getting what it wanted. But that doesn't mean privacy advocates get nothing, or that they'd count the law passage a loss. There's a large coalition, 50, maybe 100 different groups that have all been in favor of trying to end the bulk coalition, been working together on this. We mentioned the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the ACLU, FreedomWorks, Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the Constitution Project. Across the spectrum, right and left. The question is on encryption, whether or not the government will be able to break through the encryption that businesses are trying to devise to keep them out. There's an article in the New York Times, so this is from a year and a half ago or so, saying that the NSA is winning its long-running secret war on encryption using supercomputers, technical trickery, court orders, and behind-the-scenes persuasion to undermine the major tools protecting the privacy of everyday communications in the internet age. The agency has circumvented or cracked much of the encryption, or digital scrambling, that guards global commerce and banking systems. For the past decade, the NSA has led an aggressive, multi-pronged effort to break widely used internet encryption technologies, which is described in a 2010 memo describing briefings from the NSA on accomplishments of their employees. I think the encryption thing is a big deal and will continue to be something that is a bone of contention between the tech industry and the government. With regard to what we do in order to protect ourselves from the government, I think that encryption will continue to take off.
Will the senator yield for a question without losing the floor?
Yes, without losing the floor.
Well, I'm so glad to hear my colleague talk about encryption technology, because it is clearly something very important in this privacy debate. And I hear with interest as you cite that article, because one of the key things about the whole encryption debate is several years ago, the federal, those involved at the highest levels of government basically decided that instead of being able to break the encryption code, that maybe it would be a good idea to put an actual government chip in every computer. That was called the Clipper chip. And the notion was that then the NSA and other people wouldn't have to worry about breaking the codes. They would just have a government back door to our technology. And in fact, there were many people, I kept saying, you're going to say instead of Intel inside, you're going to say U.S. government inside every computer? Is that what we were trying to do? So the Clipper chip battle in the 90s was a very famous debate about exactly how we were going to proceed on making sure that we were guaranteeing privacy to U.S. citizens. So clearly, we were successful in defeating the Clipper chip, but it took a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I want to thank my colleague for continuing to fight on these important issues, and you mentioned many of the organizations that were also involved in that battle in making sure. So are you saying that now you believe there's new government efforts to thwart our encryption capabilities?
Well, thank you for that question. I think not only is there's new sort of political rhetoric attacking encryption, but I think there's going to be more efforts. This article's from about a year ago, but I think what's going to happen from this, and what I've been hearing from people, is there's ultimately going to be encryption that's not housed by any company. They're going to have the encryption. The only way you get through the encryption is through the individual. And this is being done because the government's overplayed their hand, and because the government's been such a bully on this. Companies are going to continue to get farther and farther away, and what they're going to do is the encryption will be only in the control of the user. When that happens, the government's not getting into any information at all. So they've taken a tool that probably has been useful to a certain degree, and I don't mind it if we're doing it through warrants and specific suspicion, but I think that they're pushing companies so hard that I think encryption's going to be put in a place where even the company can't get to it.
Ask another question of the senator without him losing the right. This is a debate, as you were just saying. I think I understand your premise is that there are three legs to this stool. There is the federal government who wants access, but they should go through the judiciary system. And there's separately the entities that have the actual records, which is the telecom companies, and that keeping those separates and not blending them, not actually giving the telecom companies the right to keep all the data and information of individuals is a critical distinction. And you were just describing, I think I understood, that in this case, the government was just saying, oh, you just keep all that data and information, which is not exactly what the phone companies had acquired or kept for any business purposes, but it just puts personal data and information at risk. Am I understanding that correct?
I think I understand the question, but I think that, the phone companies aren't excited about it, but they will do it if they're paid and told to do it, basically. But the phone companies, I don't know. I don't know that how much objection they've had to the current system and the new system. They probably don't want to have to hold all this. And there are rumors that the people who want more will require them to. I don't think under the current USA Freedom they're going to be required to hold the records, but they're going to be encouraged to and paid to hold the records. But I think the real question is the USA Freedom an improvement, or are we just going to have bulk collection by another name done with the phone companies holding the records? That's what my fear is.
Well, I would say to the senator, or ask the senator, in this debate, I think you are raising an important question, if I understand it correctly. It's just how much is the U.S. government going to spy on U.S. citizens? And that, combined with the question that you're asking about the changes to the PATRIOT Act and accumulation of business records, is when that individual can be a U.S. citizen. And, for example, you and I could be somewhere and you could be a individual of interest to one of these federal agencies, but just because I happen to have a cup of coffee with you, now all of a sudden my business records, all my personal information could be under investigation by the U.S. government, and I wouldn't even know about it. Is that the senator's understanding? Yeah,
I think that's a big concern, and there's a couple things that I think are alarming, that even 2 domestic emails could be routed through a server in another country, and they could be using that to actually get access to 2 Americans that are communicating from New Jersey to South Carolina. But also, I think, as Senator Wyden's pointed out, it's often or sometimes sounds like we're targeting a foreigner simply to get access to an American. Do you have a question in that vein?
I think my colleague was asking very good questions, and my intention to rejoin here in a few minutes, but I think it's important, and I would be interested in your reaction, that people understand what's at stake here. We're talking about Section 702 of the FISA Act, and that involves a very important issue of making sure when there's somebody dangerous overseas that we can, in effect, go up on that person to get that kind of information that we have to have. But what we are seeing increasingly, and we have actually put it on our website, we are seeing increasingly Americans are being swept up in those searches, and their emails are being read. And what is especially troubling to me, and I'd be interested in my colleagues' views with respect to this backdoor search loophole, this is a problem today, but it is only going to be a growing problem in the days ahead, because increasingly communication systems around the globe are merging. They are becoming integrated. It's not as if communication systems just stop at a nation's borders. So I think this is a particularly important issue. As we have talked about the amendments that we are interested in offering, I think this is a particularly important bipartisan effort. I don't think people have known a whole lot about how the backdoor search loophole takes place. We've supported Section 702 because when there are dangerous threats overseas, we want our government to be able to ensure it's taking the steps to protect the American people. But having more and more Americans swept up in these searches, particularly with the changing nature of communication systems being integrated, strikes me as a very big problem. And I am going to be back to rejoin my colleague here very shortly, but I would be very interested in my colleague's thoughts on the importance of closing this backdoor search loophole. We've tried in the past. I think that now, particularly when we've had a chance to walk this through in terms of what it really means, my hope is we can finally close it. What would my colleague's reaction be with respect to the importance of this?
No, I think it's a great question. And some are saying that through the back door of using 702, that if there was 90,000 people targeted last year through using this 702, that we collected the information on 900,000 individuals that were incidental and were not the target at all. So for every one bit of data that we're collecting on somebody, we're collecting 9 bits of data on somebody who's not the target. But that becomes part of this enormous data center that we're building. And many of those people are Americans that we're getting through the back door. But it's also why I'm here today, is I want the leadership to agree to allow us to have our amendments. That is one of our amendments, and that is a joint amendment that we've worked on. We've been working on these things for months. This only comes up every 3 years. Shouldn't they not give us a day to have a vote on some of these amendments?
I thank my colleague, and I'm going to be back to rejoin him in a few minutes. I do so appreciate my colleague's stamina and passion on this. I went to school on a basketball scholarship, and I like to think I've been able to stay in a little bit of shape, but my friend from Kentucky has sure shown both his commitment and his stamina, and I'm going to have to take a brief meeting on one of the issues that is pending, but I intend to rejoin my colleague here before long, and I thank him, and we'll have additional questions at that time. And I return the floor to Senator Paul.
Thank you for that question. In the New York Times in March of 2014, Claire Miller writes about some of just the costs on U.S. tech companies that are occurring from some of this. Microsoft has lost customers, including the government of Brazil. IBM is spending more than $1 billion to build data centers overseas to reassure foreign customers that their information is safe from the prying eyes of the United States. Tech companies abroad from Europe to South America say they are gaining customers that are shunning U.S. providers, suspicious because of the revelations of Snowden that tied these providers to the NSA's vast surveillance program. The estimates are in the billions of dollars lost to American companies. Even as Washington grapples with the diplomatic and political fallout of Mr. Snowden's leaks, the more urgent issue, companies and analysts say, is economic. Tech executives, including Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, raised the issue when they went to the White House to discuss this with the president. It's impossible to see how the full economic ramifications of the spying disclosures, in part because most companies are locked in multi-year contracts. But the pieces are beginning to add up as businesses question the trustworthiness of American technology products. The confirmation hearing last week